If you were deciding between two identical job positions, you'd be more likely to choose the one with him as your boss than with her as your boss. In fact, studies show that sometimes we opt to do the same job for a man rather than a woman for several $1,000s less. We can behave this way without even knowing it because of an implicit bias, an automatic association between female and non-leader. If you were in a new place at night and needed directions, you'd be more likely to ask him for help than to ask him, because 3/4 of people have an implicit bias associating Black men with danger. Does this make you uncomfortable? Well, that's because you're a good person. Learning we have unjust subconscious beliefs that don't line up with our conscious ones is a little disturbing. We've been socially conditioned to have all sorts of implicit biases. When they apply to social groups like race and gender, we know they're bad, but sometimes we endorse our biases. Hi, my name is Mollie Teitelbaum, and today I'm going to be talking to you about our biases towards peccadillos, or harmless offenses like having a big ego or being really nervous, or this. This might bother you a lot, and if it does, you probably don't feel badly about that. It bugs you because it's gross. You should stop. Whew. You and I have an explicit bias, a conscious bias that we know about. But what if that's not exactly why it annoys us? Philosopher Martha Nussbaum explains that we tend to react to things that disgust us like they're immoral, but really they just break social norms. And this is interesting. People who are particularly bothered by open-mouthed chewing have been shown to have abnormally high sensitivity to sound. So we don't just have an explicit bias that made that video bother us, we have implicit biases too. To describe biases like these that target peccadillos, I coined the term Peccadillic implicit bias. The idea for the name came from this scene in Good Will Hunting. He's laughing because Robin Williams just confided that his wife used to fart in her sleep. He explains that he and his wife knew all of each other's little peccadillos. He found hers to be endearing. He says, people call these things imperfections, but they're not. That's the good stuff. Now, I won't be trying to convince you to reconceive of people's peccadillos, those things that bother you about them, as the good stuff. But what I will be saying is that the traits and habits that bother us out of proportion don't merit the unfair treatment that inevitably follows from peccadillic implicit biases. Consider the 75% of the population with implicit weight bias. Common automatic associations link weight with incompetence and laziness. Medical professionals have been shown to demonstrate lower levels of care for heavier patients, spending less time educating them about their health and expressing lower desire to even help them. So our peccadillic implicit biases can be really dangerous. But our peccadillic explicit biases are sometimes super important, like when we use a conscious bias against non-friendliness to decide someone shouldn't be a salesperson or our new best friend or life partner. But explicit biases come with their implicit counterparts. It's a package deal. To give you a better idea of the sorts of things we can have these biases towards, I went through my Facebook friends and started writing down my biases towards them. His ego, she's self-important, boring, insecure, cares about looks, controlling, awkward, fake, pushover, whiny, thinks she's cool, cares about being cool, fake stupidity, apathetic, not friendly, overbearing, insecure, nervous, quiet, talks too much, bad listener, dramatic, entitled. And that brings me a third of the way through the A names. So we all have a lot of these biases. They can be sorted into this framework. Personality-based biases towards personality traits we dislike. Value-based biases towards traits and habits that reflect values we disapprove of, and disgust-based biases towards traits and habits that disgust us. Take a look at the examples and start to think of your biases in each category. Now, you may be looking at these lists of negative qualities and thinking, these are terrible. People deserve to be treated worse for them. So I ask that you shift gears now and take a moment to consider your peccadillos, those things about you that might bother the person sitting next to you. Consider to what extent you have control over these things. If you wanted to stop doing them, could you? Now imagine that for each of your peccadillos, there exist people with the corresponding peccadillic implicit biases, so that subconsciously they other you, treating you less kindly all of the time and withholding opportunities from you because of them. For most of us, this thought experiment elicits a lot of discomfort. This inconsistency in how we perceive peccadillos in ourselves versus in others can be explained by a funny psychological phenomenon. Actor-observer bias makes us really forgiving of our own faults and harsh on everybody else's. Like, if I'm being a bad listener, it's because I had a really hard day and just need to vent, but usually talking to me is better than therapy. But if you're a bad listener, you're a self-centered, inconsiderate snob. We can overcome this intense double standard by applying the same compassionate rationale we afford ourselves to others. Actually, that's the first step in debiasing. Critical analysis of our peccadillic biases and considering to what extent the explicit biases might be useful and how the implicit ones never are. Take the example of a value-based bias against greediness. Picture that one friend who's a moocher. You offer her some potato chips, she eats the whole bag. She never pays you back or returns your clothing. While we can use an explicit bias to decide not to hang out with her or tell her she needs to give our clothes back if she wants to borrow more, our implicit bias just makes us subconsciously associate people who break our values with bad moral character. So we act passive-aggressive without realizing it through what scholar Mary Rowe named micro-inequities. Micro-inequities are small acts that communicate disapproval and often go unnoticed by the person who's doing them. So we might unknowingly use an agitated tone with our friend, avoid eye contact, text under the table, or over it. These micro-inequities can be felt, and they're hurtful. We act mean because our subconscious falls prey to actor-observer bias. We perceive malicious intent, but all of these forgetful acts can be attributed to a biological personality trait, non-conscientiousness. Non-conscientiousness has been linked with high mortality rates and bad oral hygiene. If she could stop doing these things, she would. We have to keep this in mind all the time to avoid implicitly motivated mistreatment. So, how can we infiltrate our subconscious to stop acting on these biases? We can use implementation intentions. These are if-then plans of action that prime your mind to think of implicit bias under relevant circumstances. Take this catch-all implementation intention that you can plug any bias into. If someone activates my Peccadillic implicit bias against greediness, then I will treat that person with humanity. It sounds simple, but it works. Once I started using implementation intentions by repeating them to myself a few times every day, the first thing I noticed was that everybody annoys me. I'm just talking to somebody, and she starts speaking really fast and fidgeting her hands, triggers my implementation intention to be nice to anxious people. They can't help it. I'm sitting in class taking notes. Someone participates, and he speaks for 5 minutes. Triggers my implementation intention about ego, but I have to remember that confidence is good, and it could be his defense mechanism. I'm with my best friend, and then some new people walk in, and she starts acting strange. She's trying to impress them, triggers my implementation intention about people who care about being cool. Now, this one actually made me realize a new debiasing technique, mutual debiasing. My friend knew all about my thesis paper on Peccadillic implicit bias, so it was really easy for me to just tell her, I'm biased against this thing that you do. And do you know what she said? That she's been trying to stop doing it. Her self-awareness and desire to improve really helps me to not get so annoyed. So practicing openness with the people you're close to and implementation intentions for everybody else is a little tedious at first, but with some practice, it becomes second nature. I want to leave you with some food for thought. There's a risk of large-scale social injustice when peccadillos are associated with social groups. For example, many East Asian countries have traditional values of privacy and quietness that Westerners are often biased against. In our society, women are taught body insecurity, but people value confidence and have Peccadillic implicit biases against insecurity, which means that women are being treated worse and respected less for something they only do because of their social group. There are endless examples like this, and prejudiced action rooted in social group membership is a particularly dangerous breed of injustice. This only raises the stakes for combating Peccadillic implicit biases. So good luck debiasing, and know that it won't just make you kinder. You'll actually be less annoyed all the time. Thank you.